Hi, everybody. I'm Wendy Murdoch, and this is Webinars with Wendy. I just checked, and this is my 51st webinar since March when I came off the road and went into self-quarantine because of the pandemic. I had no idea that when I started, this would be so popular or that I would go on for so long. But it's really thrilling and exciting to have these guests that are so knowledgeable and so willing to share their information with me and with all of you. Today, my guest is Yogi Sharp, and he's from the UK, and we're going to be talking about the hoof. And so just remember that all of these are recorded. I'm checking, yes, we're recording, and they'll be available on my Surefoot Equine YouTube channel. So please tell all your friends that that's where they can find them. And if they subscribe, they'll get a notice every time I put up a new video. So once again, today my guest is Yogi Sharp. And Yogi, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself because honestly, I don't know your background. I just know you currently.
Okay. Well, firstly, hello everyone. Thank you, Wendy, for inviting me to speak today. I'm honoured to be amongst such a renowned company, that's for sure. I feel quite humbled by it. Yeah, so I'm Yogi Sharp, a farrier from the UK. Currently studying for my BSc Honours at Myerscough College. And I'm the founder of an educational platform, if you like, called the Equine Documentalist. I create blogs and articles, and basically what I'm trying to do is I noticed that there was a gap between the research that was going on and, you know, the owners, essentially, the owners and the practitioners. So I wanted to kind of bridge that gap a little bit. So, so what I look to do with my educational platform is bring that research in a more palatable way, really, for the people in the grassroots, if you like. So I don't consider myself anyone special, really. I just have a passion for horse welfare, and that's kind of the reason why I decided to create this educational platform. And it kind of just ran away with itself, really. So I'm quite chuffed with that. It's quite daunting sometimes because, you know, there's people out there who are far more experienced than myself. But I'm enjoying the process, and if I can help people along the way, that's great. So
basically you're collating data and information that exists in the world, but is kind of scattered, and you're pulling it together to make it palatable for the average person to understand. Is that right?
So yeah, that's the idea. It's kind of, I create like a digests, if you like. So, you know, I pick a subject, and usually it's something that I see is being widely discussed on Facebook, or questions that are being widely asked on Facebook. And then I pick that subject, and then I go and do the research, and I try to put together an article that's as science-based as I can. And obviously there's always going to be certain amounts of my own opinion in there, because it's impossible to write a completely unbiased piece. But I do my best to bring, you know, something that's as unbiased as possible, and just give people information rather than telling people what to do or anything like that, really.
So I have two questions. One, how did you come up with the name Documentalist?
Well, so I was playing with words, obviously, as you do, when you're trying to think up a name for yourself. And I realized what I was doing was documenting the research. So a documentalist is somebody who documents stuff. So I am doing my own research as well for my degree, but on the whole, most of my work, or most of my articles, is that I'm documenting what's already out there. So hence the Equine Documentalist.
Yeah. And so I have a master's degree in equine reproductive physiology from the University of Kentucky. So I'm familiar with experiments and having to go out and do the research to find out the known information before you make a hypothesis and then move forward with a plan. And so it seems to me that you're gathering, those papers can be so hard to read, some of them.
Absolutely.
And you get into the statistics, you know, they're just turn your eyes glazed over, and, you know, it's like you fall asleep halfway through the article, because they're so dry. And, you know, I mean, I've actually, I have 13 publications with my name on it as a co-author, so, which I didn't even know until I researched one day. But so I understand the process of doing research, and it can be so, unless you are used to that type of writing, of reading that type of writing and understanding how that format is, it can be very intimidating to the average person who's not used to the scientific method.
Well, it's intimidating to me. I mean, I'm very, I mean, in all honesty, I'm very new to it myself. You know, this is my first degree, but I'm that type of person. I'm a very all or nothing person. So I've chucked myself into the research, chucked myself into the books. And yeah, I mean, it's when I start reading them, I have to read them quite a few times because, like you say, it's very discombobulating a lot of the time, and you think, what can I actually take from this? So yeah, I mean, that's part of the reason why I'm doing it, because I do realize that it's very difficult for people to read these papers and take what they can from them. And then, like you say, they can be dry, so I do try to, you know, put a story to the articles, if you like, to try and make them a bit more interesting. But yeah, so that's, yeah, but I completely agree. That's part of the reason why the information doesn't get out there, because it's
totally. So when I first started writing non-scientific papers, they were so dry. I had to learn how to write to my students, you know, and that took a while, but I remember that process. And you know, when I have to look at a scientific paper, I do the cheat sheet first. I go to the summary. And I read the summary and and what is the conclusion here? And then what was the premise? And then I kind of fill it in between.
Yeah. I mean, I think anyone who said they didn't do that would probably be lying.
Yeah, I think so.
But yeah, it's, I mean, I've done a fair bit of writing in the past, not published. Well, I've had a few poems published, but I enjoy writing anyway. So it's a passion of mine anyway. So I've written poetry in the past and such. So writing is a hobby for me anyway. So it's put the two together.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. So you have a website, right? Because somebody's asking where they can find your articles.
Yeah. So the blog site is theequinedocumentalist.com. And there's quite a few articles on there now. You can just scroll down through them.
And then one of the things that I think it's important for people to understand when you're looking at a scientific paper, that in order to do a study, you have to impose controls, because there's so many factors involved. If you didn't impose a control, you would have to have thousands of horses or feet or whatever you're studying, or you wouldn't have any you wouldn't have anything at the end. It would be just a mishmash. And so when someone's about to do any kind of scientific study, the first thing they have to do is narrow the focus of that study and limit the parameters in order to make it something that actually you can come out with a conclusion, or hopefully come out with a conclusion. And not always. I mean, there's many times that you don't have a conclusion. And there's also times when statistics can help the conclusion. I've seen that when I was a research scientist, that it was back in the 90s, they were working on a lot of in vitro stuff, and grant money was tied up in results in papers. And so statistics were used to help the conclusion along. And so when you're reading a scientific paper, you always have to take into consideration, what was the premise? What are is the hypothesis? What are the controls imposed? Were they quality controls? Did you have a group that was not treated as your control group? And then what are your numbers? So if you had a study with 5 horses and one horse went lame and you couldn't have it anymore, and then another horse, the owner pulled the horse out, you're down to 3 and you're not going to come up with any good result.
Yeah.
And so these are the kinds of things, when I'm sure, Yogi, you've come across, when you're looking at a scientific paper, you have to not just take it for the words it says, but look at the quality of the design, which is really important. whether or not it's been what's called peer reviewed. In other words, peers have looked at the publication, evaluated it, and determined it's of good quality to be published in specific publications. And you can get a paper published anywhere if you find a, someone who's willing to publish it. But to get in these really high quality peer reviewed magazines and things, you have to have quality work with good controls and good numbers and a clearly defined hypothesis with a logical progression in thinking. And so that's, I'm sure one of the things you're doing is just looking at the quality of the papers that you're evaluating.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because a lot of the time these things come down to budget and time.
Yeah.
So you do have to be careful with how much you take it. You have to take it all with a pinch of salt sometimes, because the reality is that most studies these days are done with a handful of horses because it's what's practical. But what I tend to do is I don't take a study in isolation. I will always try and find other supporting studies. So if there's more than one study saying the same thing, with similar controls and that kind of thing, then you can start, in my opinion, you can start to say, oh, okay, there's some evidence behind this, but of course, when you're talking about breakthrough stuff, which my research is quite forward thinking, I won't get into it too much, so I have to be careful, but it can be really hard to find any studies to start with. And you have to start looking at studies that were unpublished, and you have to start looking at experiential opinion and that kind of thing. But I think the most important thing is accepting that. So don't take something that has limitations and say that it hasn't. So I don't think there's anything wrong in saying, this is a theory, but it has limitations because of this, this, and this. There is something wrong in saying this is exactly the truth without enough evidence.
Yeah.
But all
okay.
studies are bite sizes as well. People do bits. So someone will do a bit, and then the next study will do a little bit more, and then the next study will do a little bit more, and you start to build a picture.
Right.
So.
And that's why the referencing is so important, because when you look at a paper, you'll see that it's highly referenced in the background information. So there is always a section of what is the known body of information prior to this particular experiment. And that gives you a good idea of what the work is that has come before and what they have looked at. And I'm sure, Yogi, that you probably have looked at a lot of the older text. I had Monique on last night, and she referred to some German text, and here was the asymmetry in the foot way, way back when. And for some reason, we tend to lose certain knowledge that when we kind of go back there and look, we go, oh, it's not new. Somebody already documented it, but we've forgotten it.
Well, yeah, I was talking to my friends in my WhatsApp group the other day, actually, and we were saying that there literally is nothing new in the world. So somebody will come up with an idea, and somebody's already spoken about it, and it comes round in phases. But then it comes round, I suppose, with a deeper knowledge, and also everybody is restricted by the technology of their day as well. So you can start to look at things with new technologies and get a deeper insight. But I mean, Wendy, in all honesty, you know more about this stuff than I do. I haven't even had a paper published yet. So so I'm preaching to the choir slightly.
Okay, that was a past life. I walked away from that world in 1986.
That's when I was born.
Oh, crap. Oh, that's too funny. Yeah. So, I have a master's degree from University of Kentucky, and I was going to get a doctoral degree either in navicular bone or in the horse's spine with Dr. James Rooney. He was my advisor on my master's degree, but I looked around and I was like, this was already after a horse had fallen on me and broken my hip socket, and I finished my master's. you know, I looked around and I went, I don't want to live in concrete walls. I want to be out in the world. And so I left science and started teaching. But I've never left my roots. And so in my teaching, you know, gravity is the law. That's it. Gravity is the law. And you have to adhere to the laws of physics because it's going to kill you if you don't, right? Or hurt really badly. And so it's always been in the back of my mind whenever I'm teaching or somebody tells me something, I'm like, if I can't go back and figure out how that works within the known laws of physics, then there's a problem. And so that's what I'm, and this is where Surefoot has driven me crazy for 8 years because I put horses on foam pads and they totally change. And I think that is unique. I haven't found any research. There is a patent back when for humans, but not for animals. And so, you know, that's, you know, maybe somebody did do that a long time ago. I don't know. But it's driving me crazy because I don't have any, people go, well, what's the evidence of this? What's the data? And I'm like, there is none, you know. There will be soon. I know that it's getting closer, but, you know, as a scientist by training, it's one of the things that kind of it doesn't keep me up at night, but it does kind of nag at me all the time that I'd love to have some kind of data to support what we're seeing in all these horses around the world. But one of these days it'll happen. One of these days,
yeah. You have to get back into the science then, won't you? And get the data done.
I don't know. I was, anyway, let's go on here. All right.
Okay.
So Yogi's got a slide presentation. I'm going to run it just because of the internet situation. We thought that might be better. And by the way, this background today, this is my front yard. That's my ancient apple tree that's decided it still is going to survive. And there's some beehives way in the background. You can't really see them that are my neighbors. And so they come and pollinate all my flowers. All right, shall I screen share here, Yogi?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There we go.
Cool, perfect. Okay, so so today I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the connection between the hoof and the body. Now, this is something I'm quite passionate about because I really feel it's important that we realise that we can't, or we can no longer compartmentalise the two. Both as farriers and as anyone who works with horses. So yeah, today we're going to be looking at the hoof and the horse connection. So next slide, please, Wendy.
Can you see that?
I've got a little bit of a lag, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. So it may surprise you to hear that me as a farrier, when I turn up to a new horse, the first thing I do is actually not look straight down at the feet, but I look at the general posture of the animal and its general proportions, because this can tell me a lot about what I can expect to see when I do actually look at the feet. It also tells me what I may need to do in order to create a more ideal posture. And obviously this would be the same from in front and from behind the horse, as well as this lateral view. So I want to be shoeing the horse and not just his feet. And this is something that I'm getting quite passionate about. For instance, if you look at this chap, you can see that his metatarsal is slightly angled toward the trunk. So this tells me that I may well see morphological effects on the hind hoof.
Okay, just tell me which color line and I will draw my arrow over it to highlight.
Okay, so if we look at the point of buttock plumb line, the red line, and then we go down vertical to the ground, and then we can see the metatarsal, which is in orange. In an ideal conformation, that metatarsal would be along that point of buttock plumb line. So the horse is slightly camped under. Okay, so looking at the whole horse, I've already noticed that, and so I'm saying, okay, I may well see morphological effects on the hoof. Next slide, please. So when we then do look at the digit, we've got some established ideals that we're looking for. So we're looking for a straight hoof pastern axis being one of them. And this is directly affected by the ratio between the height of the heel and the height of the toe and their angles. So for instance, if we think back to the image I just showed where the horse was camped under behind, I could, depending on how long it had been like it and how strong the hooves are, expect to see that the angle difference between the heel and the toe getting larger with the heel angle getting more acute. So the heel angle is the blue HA.
Yep.
This brings us to what I've called the hairline pathway, which is the darker blue line. In this foot, you can see how it's just beginning to drop off at the heels. And you can also see the same in the horn tubules towards the back of the foot, starting to roll off. So, although this looks like an okay foot, it is actually starting to prolapse. The heels are starting to prolapse. So the more they prolapse, the more the posture will be affected. So there we see how the relationship forms between the whole horse assessment and the hoof assessment. So next slide, please, Wendy. These forces will act the same on a medial lateral plane too. Something that Simon Curtis discusses in his books, and also Mark Caldwell discusses in his PhD thesis, is how the hoof morphs according to the forces that act upon them. So when the gravitational load line from above doesn't bisect the hoof, it will morph according to those forces. So next slide, please, Wendy.
And can we just talk about this one for a minute, just to highlight a few things? Because one of the first things I notice is, and it may be a false thing to pay attention to, but it looks like the hairline's following the coronet band line, and that we've got a bulge here and then it drops over and the hair is kind of heading in that same direction. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I would say that the medial, so the medial is to the right.
Okay, over here. Green line.
The medial is to the right of the picture. And then the medial aspect of the hairline pathway, I'd say, is slightly higher than the lateral side. And yeah, you've got a bulge to the coronet band there, it actually bulges out, and then the medial wall angle is more upright than the lateral wall angle. So the foot is not completely symmetrical. But a lot of that would be normal because the hind hoof, you know, you do have a medial side and a lateral side to a hoof. I think Monique talked about that actually. Yes,
she did last night.
So last night she talked about how you're not looking for perfect symmetry, but you're looking for, to use a non-scientific term, good symmetry. You know, you're looking for something within a tolerable parameter.
Right.
So next slide, please.
Yep, it'll just take a second.
Are you up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you?
Sorry, I've got a lag. So then finally, I will look at the bottom of the hoof. Now, from what I've seen in the previous assessments, I'll expect to see certain shapes and morphologies in this view. So basically what we're looking for here is symmetry and well-formed structures. And I think we're so used to seeing poorly conformed feet that they become an unacceptable norm. And I wrote about that in my recent article about the unacceptable norms of equine management. And I highly recommend people read that. Now, we often forget what they're meant to look like because we're so used to seeing abnormal. So for instance, the frog, the central sulcus and the bulbs, we're so used to seeing contracted frogs, prolapsed bulbs with deep central sulci and thrush that it almost becomes not worth noting. But the reality is that the health of the back of the hoof will affect the ratios that we mentioned before, the heel and toe ratios, and have a profound effect on posture. So we will of course see medial-lateral balances from this view as well, indicated by the lighter red lines, where we're looking again for symmetry of the two sides of the hoof. But of course, as Monique said, you're not going to get perfect symmetry because the trunk of the body is onto the medial of the foot. So you're always going to get you're going to have a right foot and a left foot. But poor symmetry can be indicative of poor conformation and or where poor hoof balances influence the posture of the horse. And we also may be able to see these influences by looking at other structures like the white line and the bars. So So this, if you look at the bars, they're nice and straight, and they mirror each other. So very often we see bars that are bent and just not in the best shape. And again, that's become an unacceptable norm. But actually, we really familiarise ourselves with what a foot is actually meant to look like. Then we're going to start noticing the unacceptable norms much more.
Yeah, it's really, if we don't have a comparison, we can't make a judgment.
Absolutely.
And, so in that ravine, is this a good foot that we're looking at?
Yeah, so I've put this up because I consider it a good foot. We've got a good frog, symmetrical lateral grooves, just pretty much symmetry all round. And then importantly, we've got a central sulcus that is a small depression. I'm so used to seeing really deep central sulcuses and with evidence of the frog being contracted. But it's very, very rarely mentioned because like I said, it's become an unacceptable norm. But we have to understand that this is what it's meant to look like. And if it looks contracted and that central sulcus looks deep, then we're already down a pathological road.
It's hard to read what the light yellow line is. SC?
Solar concavity. So, you know, the sole is meant to have a dome effect. It's meant to be able to descend under load. And obviously, if you've got a flat sole, it can't descend anymore. So that's just talking about how you're meant to have a concavity to the sole.
Sorry about that. So somebody's asking, so the bar is the green line or the whitish part, but not the brown bit inside. The bar is this green line here.
Yeah, so the bar is along the green line. The green line follows the bars. So the bars are slightly inside of the green lines.
Yeah? Okay, got it. Yep.
Yep. And then you've got the lateral clefts just inside those.
Right. And the bars are actually a continuation of the hoof wall as it comes forward and in, correct?
Yeah, pretty much. They have their own germinative layer, but yeah, they're meant to be a load-bearing structure, the same as the hoof wall. Yeah.
So if you get a bar that's like folding over, what does that indicate?
Well, it can indicate lots of stuff, but very often the folding bars or the bending bars will correlate with contractures or flares. So it's telling you about the morphology elsewhere of the foot. Okay,
so when you see something like that, it's really trying to tell you something. It's not just simply that they're weak or that the horse grows excessively in the bars, but really that those are the kinds of things that when we see that, we should be taking that as a message, as opposed to just going, oh, well, that's my horse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what I'm trying to express here, is that if it's not the ideal, it's not something that we should nonchalantly, look over. We need to, prevention's better than cure. And if we can start to see these changes earlier on and recognize them and appreciate that they shouldn't be that way, then it kind of obligates us to then do something about it. Whereas if we say, oh, that's just normal, then it just perpetuates. So that's kind of the message that I'm kind of trying to express here. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Last night I told Monique a little story that when I went to Hawaii, all the horses had terrible starey coats except for one. And we asked that one.
Sorry?
I went to Hawaii. Hang on, I'll just stop for a second. And I saw all these horses with poor coats. They were dry, they were staring, but everybody's horses look like that. And then one horse arrived and it was shiny and gleamy, right? And so we asked the owner, we said, well, why is your horse different? And she said, because I line my fields, because they're on volcanic rock, right? Yeah. But everybody else, they were like, what are you talking about? Because it becomes so normal to them, they didn't see it.
Exactly.
That's the problem with not having a good example. We get so used to looking at it in one way, we just think that's the way it is.
Exactly, and that's I really do encourage people to read that article that I wrote, Unacceptable Norms of Equine Management, because that's the whole ethos of that article. So, yeah.
Yep. And Monique last night talked so much about how our local environment, the minerals, the soil, all that really plays into the health of the foot, some of which we have control over and some of which we don't.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, diet plays a huge role. No, I don't profess to be a nutritionalist. Now, that's something that, as a farrier, I do admire of the barefoot trimmers, is that they do have much more understanding, or they look to have much more understanding of nutrition. It's certainly something that I want to look further into. But
I need to find somebody for my webinars that's going to talk about nutrition.
Yeah.
If you have any recommendations, let me know.
I can't think off the top of my head. I know a few. Alicia Harlov, maybe, the Humble Hoof.
Oh, okay. I'll make a note.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, ready?
I'm pretending like I know loads of barefoot trimmers now, but I don't. So I'm picking from a small, but no, Alicia is very knowledgeable.
Okay.
So.
Humble Hoof. This is how I get more, like I gather more information by doing these.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right, so slide.
Yep.
Are we on there?
Yeah, we are.
I've got a lag. Sorry, I've got a lag. So
that's okay.
So looking closer at the back of the foot, which again is something I think is often missed, can tell you a lot about how the hoof is morphing. So I'm going to be going into much more depth on this in a video cast that I'm going to be doing with Wayne Turner from Progressive Equine in the near future. But we'll talk about a little bit about here. And thank you to Lindsay Field, Study of the Equine Hoof, for allowing me to use her image here on the bottom right. So anyway, the point of this is that the back of the hoof, again, is something that's very much missed. Daisy Bicking talked about it in a couple of her videos, actually, about the proportions of the cartilage versus the digital cushion and stuff. So I'll recommend people go and have a watch of that. But again, the morphology that we see of the back of the foot is going to have an effect on the whole body because of the effect that it will have on the ratios of the foot. So next slide, please.
And so can we talk about these for a second?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Okay, so the one on the left, the black foot, the lateral side of the foot is longer, would you say, from the center sulcus to the lateral cartilage versus the medial side?
So if I'm looking at the orange, the one with the orange lines on the bulbs.
Yep.
Yeah. So the lateral heel is contracted, and that's why it's got the wider shoe on it with the boxing. And then you can see that that's pushed the bulb up and into the foot. So that's, again, looking at that bulb with that heel can tell you a little bit about what's actually happening to the rest of the foot. And then if you look at the bottom left, you can see both heels, both lateral cartilages are almost touching.
Right.
So this is a contracted foot. And if you look at the frog area, you can see there's a really deep crevice. So you've got thrush going on. You've got everything, being squished up basically. And then if you look at the bottom middle, this horse has hardly got any lateral cartilages at all. It's pretty much all digital cushion. And again, it's got a very, very deep crevice to the frog. And then if we look at the picture that I've used, courtesy of Lindsay Field, this foot, you can see the imbalance. But then what I liked about it was that you could see the imbalance all the way back up to the bulbs. And you can see, if you look at the yellow arrows, you can see how that foot is beginning to create that very deep crevice where it's starting to contract. So that's why I put that one in there.
Yeah. So anytime we see that center sulcus on that frog is getting deeper, basically that is a red light flashing.
Yeah, I mean, it could be purely thrush and a management issue, or it could be telling you that your foot is starting to contract. So you know, everything still takes experience. I can't give you like
Right.
one for everything, but because it still takes experience to recognize what you're seeing. But you know, if you are seeing that, then you know we should be mentioning it to the professionals that need to be spoken to.
Oops, sorry about that. Okay.
Yeah. Next slide.
Yep, the horse skeleton, right?
That's the one.
Yep.
Yeah, perfect.
Trying to get us out of the way.
So going back to our whole horse body assessment, we can take a brief look at what the ideal is from a farrow-related view. So the front leg is designed to be a weight-bearing structure, so should have a column-like conformation, and much of its dampening system above the hoof is from its muscular attachment, whereas the hinds have a concertina effect, which allows them to provide propulsive power and allows the reciprocal apparatus to function the way that it does. Now, every horse will have biological variation, obviously. So they're going to have different length bones, they're going to have different angles to their joints. But something that I've been looking at and that's been emerging in studies as an ideal, some studies by some experiential opinion by Judith Shoemaker and some studies by Karen and Gelman, which are hopefully they'll be published soon. They're unpublished at the moment, but they're in very interesting studies. They've been talking about the ideal of a vertical metatarsal. So when they're in this orientation, as in vertical, so the metatarsal obviously are in green, they are counteracting gravity efficiently and bearing load in pure compression, as bones are, you know, designed to do. Now, the studies that I mentioned, they go into some very technical physics on this. But for me, I've noticed in my work that non-vertical metatarsals are almost always associated with pathology and poor hoof morphology. So that's something for me that I think we should be looking at.
So again, an indicator to start looking deeper because it's telling you something's going on. Yeah,
I think it is. And again, you know, this is, you know, I'm not going to pretend that this is proven because, you know, like as we were talking about before, but this is something that is starting to be looked into and starting to be researched. And, you know, we have in the textbooks things saying that camped under is a conformation.
Right.
But I think that's going to start to be questioned as a, well, Karen and Gelman actually call it a abnormal compensatory posture. And it's something that I'm talking about in my research as an antalgic posture. So away from pain. But again, this is not proven yet. So, you know, I'm saying this as an idea, as a discussion to have.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I think we need to question non-vertical metatarsals, and obviously that usually corresponds with a camped under posture.
Well, what I like about that as an idea is it's something simple that, you know, as it proves out, people can look at a picture of their horse and draw a line.
Absolutely.
And, you know, so much of, like, I absolutely love Monique's lecture last night, and it's very deep. And so when we pull back to the average person who wants to be able to look at their horse and do right by their horse, to have some simple evaluations that don't require equipment and force plates and angle measuring and x-rays, just to get us started so that we can ask those questions of our veterinarian and our farrier and go, I've noticed this, what do you think? So conversation starters.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not, you know, I'm not telling people to diagnose anything from the fact that their horse has got non-vertical metatarsals. And the other thing to consider here is that posture currently is a very subjective subject. So we have to remember that. Now, being able to quantify posture would obviously be a wonderful thing and something that I'm possibly looking into. But, you know, there's lots of studies in the human to show that you know, people have antalgic postures and they have compensatory postures to certain pathologies. So, you know, so why would it not be the same in the horse? And so we need to, I think we do need to take a look at, you know, the general, that's what I was talking about. The first thing I look at is the whole horse. You know, is it telling me by its body language that I'm hurting, or that there could be issues? Because I think we can tell a lot from the general demeanor and the posture of the horse.
Well, and the thing with horses and humans, and probably most mammals, is that we start to compensate before we ever acknowledge that there's something wrong.
Absolutely.
And the quicker we can see the compensation or recognize the compensation, the quicker we can get back onto the road to recovery. But, you know, we're designed to compensate.
Yeah.
I don't know a horseback rider that isn't compensating for something.
Yeah. And then obviously that will transfer to the horse when they're riding.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, I mean, and talking about that, actually, this is the reason why I tend to, this is going to be another controversial statement, I imagine, but I like to look at these horses with thermography. Now, thermography has to be done in a clinical way, otherwise it's essentially useless. So I will make sure that I make that clear. It has to be done with the correct protocols. But as you were saying before, we make compensations way before we've got structural changes. And thermography, for me, is able to pick up those early indications of physiological dysfunction. So I like to look at these horses with thermography to see if we can pick up early stages of issues.
Right. And with thermography, so just so you know that I have a very little experience with it. In '99, Dr. Joyce Harmon and I took a thermography camera to Africa, and we went to saddle fit an elephant.
Right.
I swear to God. And she brought her computer pad, her pressure pad, to measure the pressures under the saddle, but that technology failed. We fried the power charger for the thermography camera, but they hijacked it. And we did see the pattern on the elephant that we were attempting to saddle fit. It is all fabulous for finding animals at night in Africa. Okay, just so you know.
Yeah.
Yep, but calibration is the absolute key. Having somebody who is ethical using that kind of equipment, because just like the computer pad technology, changing settings can make it say what you want.
Absolutely, and not just the settings of the camera, but the whole image acquisition process has got to be clinical. And the reality is that I didn't want to get into this too much because it's kind of off subject, but thermography has got to be treated as a veterinary tool, the same as any other diagnostic modality. Because, you know, for instance, Jimenez et al. Talked about all the artifacts that you can get in radiography. And he had 6 tables full of possible artifacts from radiography. Now, you think of radiography as an established modality that you couldn't really get wrong, but, you know, if you don't take the images correctly, you're getting completely false information. So
even recently, I know people that have had, they went for an X-ray and the person said you're fine, and 2 days later, they were having surgery because somebody didn't read the X-ray properly.
Yeah, exactly. So it comes down, one, to image acquisition, but also all of my images are interpreted by specialist vets because you need to understand pathogenesis, you need to understand clinical relevance. Otherwise, you're going to throw out a load of red herrings as well. So thermography has to be done very succinctly, basically.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the screen share, and somebody's asking the question: when the metatarsals are not vertical, what were they possibly indicating?
Well, I'll touch on that a little bit in a few slides' time.
Perfect. Great. Okay. Next.
Next slide.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool.
Let me know when it's up.
Yeah, it's up. So, all right. So, So this ideal that we were talking about is referring to when the horse is standing relaxed, which most horses do for most of the day. Now, the study into the relationships between hoof morphology and dynamic influences is much more widespread, but something that is far less researched is actually the influence of static posture on hoof morphology. So static posture will have an effect on the horse's movement, but also it could prove to have impulse effects on the hoof. So a friend of mine, Norman Johnson, did a great study on impulse. Keep trying to kick him in the bum to get it published, looking at impulse dynamically. Now, impulse being force times time, okay? So force over a certain amount of time. Now, I believe a lot of the morphology we see in hooves is also actually down to static impulse or a cumulative load from just standing still. Because studies have shown us that keratin structures suffer from elastic creep. So they over time, they deform. So this image is for illustration purposes. So this isn't what actually happened in this foot, but this is for illustration purposes. So you imagine the increased load in the heels from either static or dynamic influence. That force over time would cause the heels to collapse due to elastic creep. So there we can see how a change in posture could create accumulative loads on the hoof that affect its morphology. Next slide.
Yep.
So if we look at that more schematically, now obviously this is massively simplified in order to explain a point. If we look at this more schematically, it's like a table. So when the legs are completely vertical, this is when they're the strongest against gravity and supporting the weight above them. So the red lines through the legs, through the green legs, show how they're working in pure compression. If we look at the red legs, which could symbolize camped under or base narrow or angular limb deformities, we can see how we now have shear forces acting on those legs, indicated by the orange arrows, and we will inevitably have uneven loading of the bottom of the leg, i.e. the hoof. So this will have morphological effects on the hoof because the hoof is a deformable structure between the weight of the horse and the ground. And like we stated before, Simon Curtis and Mark Caldwell discussed how the hoof deforms according to the forces acting upon it. So in a really simplistic way, we can look at the hoof as the deformable box on the left. So the box is on the left. The green box is square to the leg and the ground, and therefore it retains its shape. The red box has a high point, so the load through it is not central or perpendicular. Now, because the hoof is deformable, it will morph in order to create a level base. So we have the orange triangles showing the possible morphology that could occur. So it could either create a flare, which is the bottom left-hand orange triangle, or it could shunt, which is the top left-hand corner, or there could be, a mixture of both or other stuff. So, so that shows you how the leg not being in a vertical position, in a table sense, could affect the morphology of the box at the bottom. So, and then of course this works the other way. So if you have an unbalanced foot to your table leg, then the whole table is going to be unbalanced. Next slide.
Great illustration. That really helps clarify, because then you start thinking shear forces and vector forces, and then you start to realize you've got, exactly. Yeah, you don't have a straight line.
Yep. So what we have are two types of cycles that happen. So Mark Caldwell explains this fantastically in one of his lectures. So I've adapted it here and simplified it a little bit. But if anyone can ever go and see that, I'll highly recommend it. When you have ideal physiology, it creates ideal loads on the hoof, which leads to ideal morphology of that hoof. And in turn, we have an ideal load on the musculoskeletal system, and then we maintain ideal physiology. And then this cycle continues on and on. Now, if we have a negative influence on this cycle from different factors, conformation being one of them, then a negative non-linear cycle can be created and can become quite chaotic. The disordered physiology creates unbalanced forces, leading to negative morphology, predisposing the animal to pathology that can then exacerbate the cycle in a downward pattern. Next slide. So this cycle is very evident in negative plantar angles, something that I'm looking into. You hopefully can see in these examples how the horses have a camped under posture associated with negative plantar angles. Mansman et al. 2010 associated negative plantar angles with this posture. Whether the negative plantar angles come first or the posture comes first, we don't actually know yet, but there is a clear cycle that goes on. So with no intervention, these will often get worse and worse. And a long story short, the posture, to hypothesize, creates increased load on the heels and crushing them from what we were talking about earlier. So this leads to a poor phalangeal alignment, often meaning the posture gets even worse as the horse brings the limb further under the trunk to create a straight hoof pastern axis. Now, breaking the cycle by intervening with farrier intervention, as you can see in some of these pictures, helps to also create a better posture, which leads to improved morphology, and then the cycle starts to work back the other way.
So we have our really camped under horse on our top left.
Yep.
And then we've got our nearly ideal line between our point of our buttocks and our metatarsal.
Yeah, and that was in one shoeing. That was that was on the same day, that change.
Wow.
So.
Wow, that's impressive.
And that comes from establishing the ideal proportions of the digit. But that just shows you how interconnected everything is. You know, if you're thinking about, well, I'm going to touch on that a little bit more in a minute, so I won't say too much on that.
Okay. And then the top right pictures. So yes. We go from left to right there.
Yeah.
And so this is our horse presenting before you've done anything with him.
Yeah. And then the first shoeing, second shoeing, and then gradually working our way back out of the intervention that we did.
And how long did this take, roughly? This
took about 8 months, I think, remembering rightly, about 8 months.
And then what did the owner see in terms of rideability?
Well, so the horse on the left appeared sound, but I kept on asking for it to be sent for investigation because of this posture that I couldn't ignore. And it was found to have kissing spine, sacroiliac inflammation, and proximal suspensory desmitis. And so obviously after this, we did the farrier intervention. Now, if you look at the second to last one on the right, oops. Yeah, the second to last. Here
we go. Yep, the 3-degree dual ellipse.
With the green line, yeah. That was straight after ligament snip surgery. So you can see how the farrier intervention got us so far, but it wasn't until the ligament snip surgery that we actually managed to get an ideal conformation, posture, if you like, sorry.
Right.
Because, you know, we're questioning what's conformation and what's posture here, right?
Right.
So it wasn't until the foot was in the right place and the higher pathology was treated that we then were able to get an ideal posture.
And then in terms of performance with this horse?
Well, it's going through a rehab program, but it's obviously progressing through that rehab program quite nicely.
Right. Right. So they're seeing that, and my point being that, you know, it's not just showing the foot. The whole point of showing that foot better is to see that horse improve in its function.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right.
And the posture, and the reality is on the left, that horse was getting worse and worse, and the cycle was perpetuating.
Right.
We had to break the cycle from both ends, you know, to really treat the horse properly. And this is my point, is that we can't compartmentalize the two. So, but again, I'm going to go on to that a little bit more in a minute. So,
okay. Are we leaving the lower pictures for now?
Yeah, I mean, they're essentially the same, showing the same progression. So they're not a lot to say to them. They're just the same thing. All
Okay.
right. So next slide.
Yep. I'm just going to check on some questions here.
So what I was going to say to that, which we covered a little bit, is that talking about the farrier intervention, but saying that we must be aware of it. What we must be aware of is what we mentioned in the previous slides, that the cycle is created by influences on that cycle. And we must ensure that we address those influences so the cycle is broken. So the example we've used, negative plantar angles, has been linked to pathology all the way up the hind limb by the studies you can see in the image. And this is something that Martina and I discussed in our video cast. Again, which way round the causation of the cycle is between the hoof and the high pathologies is unknown and is to be researched. But nonetheless, as we've seen from those previous slides, the cycle needs to be broken and shows us the close relationship between the hoof and the body. And like I said in the previous slides, the cycle may not be linear. It could be quite chaotic and complex. So this expresses the importance of a team of professionals to work it all out. And again, this, you know, I like to use thermography, something which I think is actually the future of preventative care, done in a clinical way, obviously, to assess the kinetic chain that we see here along the dorsal myofascial line, to find all of the possible influences on the cycle.
Well, and the thing is, the sooner we can recognize that there's a problem, the faster we can intervene to get things going back in a good direction.
Exactly, and that change in posture can be a very early sign. Or that, like you said, you know, we tend to start compensating way before we've got major issues.
Right.
So if we can recognize that posture from a very early stage, then, like you say, we can hopefully intervene much earlier.
Yeah, and I know Dr. Hillary Clayton, and I have never forgotten, I used to organize workshops, 4-day workshops up at her place at MSU before the economic crash, but that's another story. But the thing that stuck with me is that she said that the first thing to go is suspension. And so when you have your dressage rider that says, my horse feels flat, that's a warning sign.
Yeah.
And you know, there's hopefully not a lot of pathology to find at that moment because it's just beginning. And the sooner we can not recognize these early signs and do something, the faster we're going to be back onto the road to recovery and function. And
100%, absolutely, yeah. And that's really the message that I'm trying to push here. So yeah, exactly. So yeah, are you on the next slide?
Yep.
Yep. So again, referring back to the talk I did with Martina and the webinar that she actually did with yourself, you can see here that many of the myofascial lines go into the foot. So this shows us where cycles could possibly be created. Now, Martina spoke extensively on this subject, and I couldn't anywhere near match her knowledge on it. So I'll just briefly relate it to this lecture. But the principles of kinetic chains, myofascial lines, and biotensegrity mean that any anatomical point along these lines could affect every other. And that, of course, includes having morphological effects on the hoof and vice versa. So going back to negative plantar angles, I mentioned, you can see the blue line, being the superficial dorsal line, follows the pathologies that we saw in the previous slide associated with negative plantar angles, and it goes all the way into the foot. So there, straight away, you can see why the studies have linked the two, because they're connected by the myofascial line.
I think this is one of the most fascinating slides that you have. And I've known about fascia, but I haven't known about fascial lines. And the more I learn about fascial lines and fascia, the more fascinated I become. but the interrelatedness, once again, the interrelatedness of the whole body, and that we can't ignore what's happening in one place and think it's in isolation.
Absolutely, absolutely. And what's incredible is that there's, you know, I think, I have to apologise, I've forgotten her name, but there's a famous lady who does the dissections who talked about the hyoid. I think in one of her dissections, she plays with the hyoid and it moves the hind foot or something like that. It's just incredible how everything's so interconnected, and this is something that I'm really becoming aware of, and understanding that you know, we can't ignore issues like poor hoof imbalance, because it's not just going to affect the hoof, it's going to affect the whole horse, and of course vice versa. So this is where, like, if farriers have normally got a good foot and they start to see morphological changes, that's the time to say to the client, has this horse changed in any way? Is its movement changed? Is something going on? Because if everyone can start to think in that preventative, proactive way, then, you know, like we were saying earlier, we can start to recognize that things are going down the wrong road far quicker, far earlier, and hopefully we can do something about it.
Right. Sharon May Davis is the...
That's the one, yes. My apologies.
Put her name in. Thank you,
Yeah.
Gracie. And yeah, I mean, that's the thing is the more we can start to recognize these subtle signs, these little messages, and not just write them off. And whether that's, you know, from whatever aspect, teeth, feet, back, saddle, rider, nutrition, health, right? That the foot is telling us a story. The muscling is telling us a story. The fascia is telling us a story. And that's one of the reasons that I'm doing these webinars, is for people to start realizing how multidimensional this system is, and that any one entry point can actually hit so many other systems, that it's always about finding, well, what is, in my opinion, I'm always looking for what's the most critical at this moment, right? Because if we can find the part that's the most critical, like when I look at a rider, I'm looking at a rider, a saddle, and a horse, and I have to instantly decide, is it the horse that I need to work with first, the saddle, or the rider? Because if I ignore the most critical, I can't get anywhere with the rest of it.
Yeah.
You know?
And also, you know, with the technology that we've got now, for instance, like thermography and like objective gait analysis, and with deeper understanding of the connectivity of everything, you know, why are we waiting for them to be broken?
Yeah, exactly.
You know, we don't need to be, when we've got that kind of technology. And again, sorry to keep pushing it, it's free, so it's but if you read my article on the unacceptable norms, and I talk about all of that in there, you know, we've come to an era where we need to have a paradigm shift in the way that we think about horses into a much more proactive, preventative management.
Yep. And I think there's a number of reasons why we've gotten here. One is that horses are not our livelihood anymore for the majority of us. And so, you know, like when you think about a horse being a soldier's vehicle, his life absolutely depended on that horse. And so, you know, he couldn't ignore certain things, or he was going to be on foot and he would be, you know, he could be dead, to be quite simple. And so if they're your beast of burden and they're plowing your fields, you've got to take care of them, because that's your livelihood. And the further we've gotten away from that aspect, not that it was all perfect, I'm not saying that, but as we get away from the function of actual use into more pleasure, where, you know, we're not immersed in horses all day long, we're busy sitting at our computers and things like that. You know, lack of exercise is one of the number one things that's a problem, right? Horses should be moving more. People should be moving more. I mean, it's a common problem across the board. But the other thing to our advantage is that in this modern day, we have the tools and technology to investigate things and to have better understanding and better diagnostics and get there quicker when we recognize a problem that they didn't have in the past.
Absolutely. Also, something else to consider in this equation is that horses have become more accessible.
Yeah.
So, it's quite easy to get a horse these days, but what people don't perhaps sometimes appreciate is that doesn't mean that they're cheap. And they certainly shouldn't be. And, I think a lot of the time, some people might not like me for saying this, is that we spend money on things like a nice shiny bridle or nice new tack. Now, of course, tack's proven to be essential. Like all the studies by Mackenzie Guire talked about the importance of tack and how that affects biomechanics. But having said that, if we need to prioritize the money that we spend on our horses. And if we need to put more priority into proactive assessment and monitoring of them to make sure that we keeping them in optimum health, because horses are genuine creatures, so they will put up with so much, and it's usually way down the line before they tell us. Mm-hmm. But that's not fair. So we need to be putting our money into those kind of monitoring systems to look after them better, basically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one of the things with Surefoot pads that I think of them as magnifying glasses, because when you put a horse on pads, the imbalance in the foot is so much more obvious because the pad's going to give to the pressure. Or you can see how the muscling in the shoulder is different, or one leg responds in a different way, or so it helps people see things. And when I do this with a rider on board, it breaks their habitual patterns of belief. I mean, so many riders go, oh, my horse, he's just difficult. Or my horse just, he won't turn to the left. He's always, making my life miserable. And then when they sit on the horse and they feel this horse move around and sway and change and then walk off and think about his foot and how it meets the ground, it changes their perception, and they realize, wait a second, there's something going on. This pattern that I've tolerated, ignored, and lived with actually may have a cause, and that we need to look deeper.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and while it's not a diagnostic tool unless it's in the hands of a veterinarian, it's a great conversation starter. To help people start.
I think that's a real take-home message. Actually, really, is that in order to see, we have to look. Mm-hmm. And it's about recognizing those little signs and then asking the questions. It's not, like you say, then there may not be diagnostic tools yet. You're not going to say this is because of this, but if you can start asking the questions, then we can start getting the answers.
Absolutely. Dr. Feldenkrais, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Feldenkrais method, but Dr. Feldenkrais said, if you can ask the question, you already have the answer. And it's the ability to formulate that question as opposed to just thinking that somebody else is going to do it for you, that we have to be willing to start asking the questions. And then the caveat to that is I believe that when we can ask a question, we always have the ability to find the answer. That, especially in this day and age of technology, if we can ask the question, we can Google it, if nothing else, and at least get started on the path.
As long as we ask the question genuinely and unbiasedly, otherwise we can make up our own answers, can't we? But
fair enough.
Right, next slide.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There we go.
So just got a couple of.
Did I screen share? Are we on screen share?
Oh, no, you haven't screen shared, no.
Okay, wait. I got to get back to. Sorry, I blew that. Screen share. It was great for me.
Cool. Yeah.
Play from current slide. There we go.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, now I've just got a couple of examples really of this hoof body interactions. So another example of this relationship, which shows how important it is for any body workers to consider the hoof, is something that Kilmartin spoke about in a 2014 paper, which I'll read here. So, looking at the sole of the hoof, the medial wall is higher than the lateral wall. In these cases, the transverse, ascending and descending pectoral muscles are working along with the subscapularis and brachiocephalic to keep the forelimb under the body. These horses, again, consistently show pain or reactivity over the cartilage of the scapula. There is no pain or flinching at all after correct adjustment and permanent resolution with a leveling hoof trim. So there we go. Now, if you look at the two images that I drew on the right, I've underlined the muscles that Kilmartin mentions. So, if people are having perpetual issues with, in this instance, these particular muscles, you've got to go and look at the feet, and you've got to question whether, the feet are causing this perpetual cycle. So, for body workers, and I'm not suggesting people that they tell the farrier that they're doing something wrong, because we must remember that hoof morphology has also been caused by an influence. Mm-hmm. So that influence could be a conformation fault or something. So we must remember that there's a cycle. So, it's not about assigning blame, it's about working out the cycle and seeing what you can change.
An injury, is something as simple as falling down in the field.
Exactly, yeah. And we don't know because it's not been studied, but possibly issues in these muscles could cause the morphology of the foot, because these things work both ways. But this just shows quite a clear link that was outlined by Kilmartin. Right. And then this image on the left is an example of one that I shod, which clearly had a medial lateral imbalance, as Kilmartin's talking about. And then by creating, by the trim and by shoe placement, we changed the balance. And then, as Kilmartin suggests, that's going to have a positive effect on those particular muscles.
Right. And pectoral muscles are really important in thoracic sling and lifting the withers.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously, considering the myofascial lines, it might not stop there. It could go further and further. So next slide, please.
I'm there.
You're there?
Yep.
Oh, right. Okay.
Are you not there?
No, I'm not there yet.
It's the one with the X-ray in the upper left, right? Straight hoof pastern axis.
Yeah, I've missed a slide.
Uh-oh, hang on.
No, it's not you, it's me, because I've got an extra slide here.
Oh, okay.
I haven't sent to you. Can I share?
Let's try it. I'll stop my share. You go ahead and hit screen share, and let's see if it'll work.
Bear with me 1 minute.
Yep, no problem. I'm gonna have a drink of water.
I've got to open it up.
Okay. And, I think plasticity was the word that Monique used last night. We tend to think that things are the way they are, but there's nothing really fixed. And the ability to change is so huge. And that whole question of posture versus conformation starts to get bigger and bigger, because we get used to seeing horses in a certain shape.
Sorry, I'm just trying to work this out. Share screen.
Yep, share screen. Then you're going to get little icons on your desktop. There you go. You pick the right, yep, there you go.
Then I've got to go back through the, sorry about this.
Okay, it's a nice little review.
There we go, okay. So this is the slide that I wanted to show. So another study that we can really see full body kinetic change in action is Hobbs et al., which looked at high-low hoof conformations. It found that uneven feet, so high-low hoof conformation, created uneven propulsive forces due to their different interactions with the ground. So to put it very simplistically, it's like having your brake half on one side of your car. So you're always going to want to pull to one side, right? Mm-hmm. So the horse needs to use spinal stiffening and hind limb compensations to maintain a straight line. So you've got a problem in the front foot and the spine has to stiff, and the hind limbs need to compensate. So you've got a full body kinetic chain there. And so these horses are going to be prone to musculoskeletal issues, and they're going to need probably seeing more often by a chiropractor or physio or whatever. So now Ridgway stated this in a paper, that the horse has to twist its head and neck to keep the eyes level, and horses therefore often exhibit muscle pain, stiffness and spasm in the base of the neck. So moreover, because of dural torque, the tube in which the spinal cord is suspended and anchored, vertebral dysfunction and fixation occurs at the base of the neck. This then accounts for the muscle tension and pain around the 6th and 7th cervical vertebrae. It also causes dural torque twisting at the level of the pole and at the lumbosacral connection. Chiropractic issues are therefore common at all three levels as a result of high, low, heel. So that's from Ridgway. So there you can really see, you know, the connection between the hoof and the whole body, and how it's all going to affect each other. So I thought that was, you know, you've got high-low hooves, you've got issues in your neck, you've got issues in your back, you've got potential issues all the way down the hind limb. You're going to have asymmetrical forces acting on the hoof, on the back hooves as well. So very often you have a matching imbalance in the hind hooves. So there you go. It's like a full body kinetic chain there, and so, you know, it's really pushing the message that you know, if you've got issues in the spine or issues in your neck, or, you know, anywhere in between, you know, we've got to be considering the base of the horse.
Wow. That's a very cool study.
Yeah, I mean, I've extrapolated a lot from that, I have to admit.
Yeah, but that's okay. That's I mean, it makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah. So I'm still sharing, aren't I?
Yes.
Or do you want to sharing?
Yeah, because your audio got worse.
Yeah, that's the problem that I have when I share. So that's why I'm going to stop.
But that was well worth doing that for that slide.
Yeah, good.
Okay. So we'll
hang on.
over here. There we go. All right, I'm back up again now with the one with the X-ray on the left-hand side.
I've got to get my, sorry.
Okay. I'll just check and see if there's any questions.
Right, there we go. Okay, I'm back on.
Oh, so someone's asking if there's typical causes for the high-low hooves.
So I wrote an article on high-low hoof conformation. So please feel free to read that. A few of them off the top of my head. It's very common in ex-race horses because possibly because of one-ray training around the track. So they very often have one metacarpal longer than the other, so it could be actual limb length disparity. And also Van Heel did some studies on youngsters. So when they're feeding, they prefer 1 foot. So, you know, that and it could be injury. But if you read that article, I go into it in some depth.
Great.
So are we on the next slide now?
Yep.
Okay. So the farrier's role in breaking this cycle is to aim to create a base that is as ideal for supporting the gravitational load lines and everything that above it as possible. And as we've seen, this will very often have a very profound effect on the position of the table leg, if you like. Now the 2 pics on the right show some of my interventions to create a better base under the horse, and we saw the one on the bottom right earlier. The shoeing job in the left lateral radiograph was done by a friend of mine, Doreen Madden. Very nice job indeed. And it shows farrier intervention to create ideal proportions of the digit, which in my experience is what helps to create the ideal posture of the horse. So, next slide, please.
Okay, it's up at my end.
Yep. So to conclude, in very much the same way as my talk with Martina did, everything that we do to the musculoskeletal or neurological systems, whether that's be through surefoot pads or otherwise, will directly affect the morphology of the hoof, and also vice versa. So when dealing with musculoskeletal issues, the hoof has got to be considered, and the hoof affects everything, and everything affects the hoof. So that's my talk.
Yeah, awesome. All right, I'm going to stop the screen share for a second. You know, I mean, for me, it always goes back to what is making contact with the ground. It's the foot. It's the base of the building. Yeah. And you've got to make sure that it doesn't matter, I can't remember who said it. It doesn't matter what the leg does through the air. It matters what happens when the foot hits the ground. If it's not hitting the ground in a solid, secure way, you know, with a good landing, if it's hitting toe first or laterally really heavily, or it's going to throw the entire system off. Just like if we were trying to run on the outside of our feet.
I mean, yeah, having said that, you know, Martina talks a bit about the swing phase and stuff like that. And obviously the movement also has major impacts as well. But yeah, to a certain extent, you know, how that foot hits the ground, because at the end of the day, you know, like we said, the hoof is the point of contact with the ground, and it's deformable structure in between the weight of the horse, and the horse initiates movement by pushing off of that structure. So so everything comes from there.
Yeah. So someone's asked a question. This is a very basic concept of bringing a Campton horse posture straight. Is it a concept to raise the heels in the hind hooves to bring that Campton posture straight?
Without going into the whole protocol, it's not as simple as that. It's not just about raising the heels. It's about creating proportions, balance, the adequate amount of length. I found that length of the shoe plays a huge role in the position of the limb as well. It's another whole subject. But it really, for me, it's about, like I said before, it's about creating the ideal proportions and the ideal. So, you know, to go back to kinetic chains, the position and orientation, I think this is from a Levin study, the position and orientation of every anatomical point affects every other anatomical point. So if the hoof is orientated in its optimal position, it's going to have an optimal effect on the rest of the myofascial line and the rest of the kinetic chain. So it's about creating optimals of the hoof in proportions.
Yeah. And then there's always the ideal and then reality. And
yeah.
Reality always gets in the way, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But we need to be careful not to throw away things that we can have an effect on because they are reality. So we need to understand what parameters we can affect, what parameters we can't affect, and be careful not to accept unacceptable norms.
Yeah, it's such a dance of constantly learning and evolving. And I think for me, one of the things that's so important is I may not have known something before and I've made it, you know, and I've caused a problem, but as I gain information, it's my responsibility to use that information to make wise choices. And it's when I don't use that information that I abdicate my responsibility to my horse.
Yeah. Well, what I've really enjoyed from creating the Equine Documentalist is I get messages nearly every day of people telling me, oh, I took photos of my horse and drew lines on it today. Now, they may be doing it completely wrong, but the fact is people are looking, and that's what I'm trying to encourage. And you know, because at the end of the day, the buck does end up stopping with the owner, because they need to ask the right questions, and they need to demand the right treatments. So, you know, that's why, you know, my page is kind of focused on the owner and on the other kind of practitioners, because so that they can ask those questions, because you know, if the questions get asked, we'll get somewhere. If they don't get asked, if they get ignored, then everything perpetuates.
Right, right, absolutely. Well, this has been another fascinating webinar, and I've really enjoyed this one, Yogi, because for one, it's a little slower pace than some of the others I've had recently. So I can kind of sit back and take in the information and just in a little easier way. It's really great.
Well, that's kind of what I try to do, because I appreciate that. You know, I teach. You know, I've got lots of experience teaching kids, and I kind of bring that into it. And the reality is I want people to actually learn something. So, you know, if you're gonna, there's no point in sounding really smart and really clever if it's going over people's heads. So that's kind of the purpose of the Equine Documentalist, is trying to make things palatable, so it actually, you know, gets used.
Yeah, no, it's been great. It's been really, really fun, and I'm really glad that we've had this webinar, because we've chatted a little bit. I think we had a Skype call once, and you know, back and forth on Facebook. But it's a pleasure to listen to you and to look at the research you're doing, and see the thought that's going in behind it, and the intention. I want to thank you very much for being one of my.
Thank you.
And
well, thank you again for having me. It's been lovely. It's been really enjoyable.
I might call on you again. You never know.
Okay. Okay.
You know, might be in a little while, but I'm going to keep the webinars going. I'm pretty much going to go through June, and then I'm supposed to go back to my day job of teaching riding in July. That's the plan at this point.
Yeah.
I do want to keep these webinars going, because it's a great way for people to go to one-stop shop to learn about a lot of different things. And so,
yeah, no, I think it's brilliant.
And I've been enjoying them. Well, so thank you once again for joining us. This has been just a really interesting educational experience with Yogi. And remember that you can find all of the webinars on the Surefoot Equine YouTube channel. If you're interested in learning more about Surefoot, our website is now open. It's surefootequine.com. You can go to Fans of Surefoot and ask questions. We have a great group of people out there that are willing to help, and the Surefoot Equine Facebook page. Thank you again for joining us. And tomorrow it's just me for the Surefoot talk. I'm still working on what my topic's going to be, so stay tuned. I'll see you tomorrow. And thanks again. And thanks, Yogi.
Bye.
Bye.